Hello and welcome. On the landmark occasion of the 15th anniversary of BRICS, BRICS nations reiterated their commitment to enhancing intra-BRICS cooperation under the three pillars: political and security, economic and financial, and cultural and people-to-people exchanges. At the conclusion of the 13th BRICS summit on Thursday, the leaders adopted the New Delhi Declaration, which called for maintaining peace and upholding human rights in Afghanistan. The declaration also condemned the terror attacks near the Hamid Karzai Kabul International Airport that resulted in a large number of deaths and injuries last month. The New Delhi Declaration welcomed adoption of the BRICS Counter-Terrorism Action Plan for the implementation of the BRICS Counter-Terrorism Strategy. The virtual summit chaired by Prime Minister Narendra Modi highlighted the situation in Afghanistan and said the country should not become a threat to its neighboring countries, a source of drug trafficking and terrorism. Thoughts that were echoed by the other leaders as well. We'll be discussing all these issues and more over the next 1 hour in Focus today. I'm Rukma with you, and I'd like to introduce at this point our guests, our distinguished panel of guests who will be joining us for this discussion. Rajiv Bhatia, former senior diplomat, a very warm welcome to you, sir. Mr. Akshay Mathur, Director, ORF Mumbai, and Rajan Kumar, who is an Associate Professor, School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. A very warm welcome to all our distinguished guests. Well, first of all, coming to you, let's listen in of how there was a strong reference in the New Delhi Declaration to the BRICS Counter-Terrorism Action Plan as a measure for implementation of BRICS Counter-Terrorism Strategy. Leaders expressed strong condemnation of terror in all its forms and manifestations. Let's listen in.
There was strong reference in the New Delhi Declaration to the BRICS Counter-Terrorism Action Plan as a measure for the implementation of the BRICS Counter-Terrorism Strategy. Leaders expressed strong condemnation of terrorism in all its forms and manifestations and committed themselves to combating terrorism in all its forms and manifestations again, and particularly of cross-border movement of terrorists and terrorism financing networks and of safe havens.
There was also a lot of discussion on Afghanistan. There was reference in the joint statement as well as in the New Delhi Declaration. Leaders called for refraining from violence and settling the situation by peaceful means in Afghanistan through an inclusive intra-Afghan dialogue to ensure stability, civil peace and law and order.
On Afghanistan, understandably, there was a lot of discussion, and there is a reference to that in the joint statement, the New Delhi Declaration as well. Leaders called for refraining from violence and settling the situation by peaceful means in Afghanistan through an inclusive intra-Afghan dialogue so as to ensure stability, civil peace, law and order in the country. They also underscored the priority of fighting terrorism, including preventing attempts by terrorist organizations to use Afghan territory as terrorist sanctuary to carry out attacks against other countries.
And in the declaration, it was also emphasized to uphold human rights, especially those of women and children and minorities in Afghanistan. Brazil's President Jair Bolsonaro in his remarks also referred to the central role of the UN Security Council in addressing the Afghan issue.
They also emphasized that the humanitarian situation to uphold human rights, including those of women, children and minorities. I may also add that President Bolsonaro in his remarks also referred to the central role of the UN Security Council in addressing the Afghan issue.
And we go to our guests now. First of all, coming to you, Mr. Rajiv Kumar Bhatia. Well, sir, when we talk about what we were just listening to, the MEA's briefing, first of all, there was strong reference to the New Delhi Declaration, to the BRICS Counter-Terrorism Action Plan as a measure for implementation of BRICS Counter-Terrorism Strategy. All the leaders expressed strong condemnation of terrorism, terrorism featuring in a big way. Was it expected?
Greetings from Gateway House, where I work as distinguished fellow, and as you know, I'm a former ambassador with some experience of having worked in South Africa, a very important member of BRICS. You have a very pertinent question. I think BRICS is a work in progress. It has been evolving for the past 15 years. So it is the job of experts and scholars to determine every year as to what incremental progress that has been made. I think counter-terrorism has been a part of the regular strategy of BRICS for a number of years. Many things which have gone into the Delhi Declaration are a kind of a very well-advised repetition. But yes, as you rightly pointed out, the focus on Afghanistan was something very new. In fact, it almost seemed at one stage that the BRICS summit will be completely hijacked by the Afghanistan issue. That would have been a pity, because so many institutions, so many people, so many officials, leaders, Sherpas had worked on a very broad and meaningful agenda for the 5 countries, and therefore one can see that after making their position very clear on Afghanistan, they went on to do and talk about many other important elements of the agenda. Finally, on Afghanistan, I think the common position of BRICS countries has been put across very clearly. The only question is whether all the members, particularly China, would ensure or would not ensure that the assurances given and the commitments taken now by them would actually be followed in practice. That is the big issue, that is the big challenge to be watched.
Right. The big challenge and that is the big issue. Well, coming to you, Mr. Mathur, when we talk about Afghanistan and the way that it featured in the entire conversation, in the entire summit throughout, and finally in the Delhi Declaration, what would you say if we look from the point of view of the layman, say for example, the importance that is being placed on Afghanistan, how it could affect India, how it could affect China, how would it change geopolitics in the area, the continuously changing scenario in Afghanistan?
I think if you were to look at it from, as you said, from a common citizen's perspective, the best way to look at it is the importance that international security has gradually played into BRICS, which, if you remember, was originally actually an economic forum. It was designed as a counter to the Bretton Woods institutions, World Bank and IMF, and slowly international security issues have crept in. And this is perhaps not a surprise, and maybe even welcome in certain quarters, because the geopolitical situation has become so important now that you cannot discuss commercial engagement in isolation. And if you look at the kind of work that has happened, there's a dedicated counterterrorism working group, and the meetings are held at the level of high representatives. Of course, the NSA, Ajit Doval, led it from the Indian government. But if you asked about China, the Chinese were represented by Yang Jiechi, and Yang Jiechi is the highest ranking member of foreign affairs in the Chinese government. And it's the same official of the Chinese Communist Party who was ambassador to China, who led the talks with the United States in Alaska, if you remember, a few months ago. So that is a very high representation. And from Russia, you had the chief of their security, the secretary of the Security Council, who was in India recently for NSA level talks on Afghanistan. So the level of representation that all the 4-5 countries are putting together and the discussions that are taking place, I think, are indicative of the importance that is being placed on this issue. And on particular, you will note that even in his opening remarks, President Putin mentioned about Afghanistan and and that was a public statement. He mentioned how important Afghanistan is. And if you look at the details of the counterterrorism strategy that has been put out, it is not just about terrorists. It is also about internet misuse of internet by terrorists. It is about terrorist financing. It is about drug trafficking. All of these, which are ancillary and supporting channels for a bad geopolitical situation, which can happen in Afghanistan, which will affect India and all the BRICS countries. So I think if you have to look at it in context, you have to see the evolution and the weight that the BRICS leaders have put behind this process.
Right. Mr. Rajan, we'd like your comments on this matter. What do you feel about the stress that was placed on counterterrorism strategy, the views and opinions of BRICS in this regard, and how big a difference would they make?
Thank you, Ms. Rukma Dutt, for asking me this question. Let me take you to a little bit of background of the BRICS. I think the major focus of BRICS, when it went to terrorism, was in 2016 Goa summit, again chaired by the Prime Minister of India. So that was the beginning. But one of the setbacks in that particular forum was that neither country, Pakistan was mentioned, nor any of the organizations operating from there were mentioned. So that was a major setback in terms of Indian strategic thinking as far as this terrorism issue is concerned. The second major development took place in Xiamen in China, the 2017 summit meeting, where Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed, Haqqani Network, ISIS, a number of other terrorist networks were clearly mentioned. And this meeting, counterterrorism, is an important issue. If you see 3-4 major issues, one is reforming multilateral system. The second one is terrorism and counterterrorism. And the third is digital cooperation. And the fourth one is people-to-people exchange. So counterterrorism is one of the most important issues from India's perspective. As far as Afghanistan and the issue of terrorism in Afghanistan is concerned, there is an agreement among the BRICS states that Afghanistan should not become the hub of terrorist activity for ISIS, for Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups. So there is a consensus. Where the countries do not agree is some of the terrorist networks which are sponsored and supported by Pakistan. For instance, Haqqani Network. Now, the contradiction that I see is that 2017 Xiamen meeting, it was clearly mentioned that Haqqani Network is a kind of terrorist organization, and this was accepted by all the BRICS states. Now, the problem is that Haqqani Network is a part of Taliban government now. And this Sirajuddin Haqqani, he's the interior minister actually. So the question now, the contradiction and the challenges before the BRICS state is that how do you deal with now a government which includes at least 14 globally designated terrorists? Whether number one is the issue of legitimacy. First, are these countries willing to provide legitimacy to the Taliban government there? The second is that if yes, then how do you deal with the people who are in the part of the cabinet? So India, as far as India is concerned, India needs to recalibrate its strategy in Afghanistan because the kind of advantages that we had with the previous government there, so that is somehow not there. So we need to kind of rework on our strategy as far as the issue of terrorism is concerned.
Right. Mr. Bhatia, when we talk about from India's point of view, from India's perspective, is there a sense that it will have to recalibrate its policy in Afghanistan now that that government is not there, the previous government is not there? And when we talk about refraining from violence, how can BRICS impact that in Afghanistan?
I think the central point here is that the 5 BRICS countries have agreed on a common position on Afghanistan. Now we have to look below the surface. Afghanistan indeed has global implications, so we can certainly say that all the members are interested in the subject. But at the end of the day, for South Africa and Brazil, Afghanistan is a very distant land. But it is different for the 3 Asian powers, Russia, China and India. For them, this is all happening in their neighborhood. And therefore, there is a convergence from the Indian perspective among these 3 countries that Afghan territory should not be used for terrorist activities aimed at these three and other countries in the region. So this is the heart of the matter, and I think India has every reason to congratulate its own diplomacy because India was the chair, and therefore this consensus has emerged under the leadership of Prime Minister Modi. The skepticism that I exhibited was, since you want to go in detail, is with regard to the motivations of China. China seems to be in a great rush to recognize the Taliban government. China is willing to support all the adventures and misadventures of Pakistan in Afghanistan and elsewhere. And on top of that, China probably would be willing to turn a blind eye if the jihadi militant organizations go and harm countries other than China. Now, if this is the reality and the ugly reality, then we will have to work together to ensure that the commitments given by China are adhered to. And I would add one additional point in the end, which is that in this context, Russia would have a major role to play. We would be watching how Russians help the countries to implement this consensus in full detail. I think if that happens, and if these agreements don't remain on paper, then I would say they would be a great triumph for BRICS.
Right. And when we talk about the stress on an intra-Afghan dialogue, after so many years of the United States maintaining the peace there with its soldiers, that's how most people understand it. How do you look at this? The BRICS, in the New Delhi Declaration, there is the concept of an intra-Afghan dialogue, which BRICS nations have come to a consensus on, that this will help in maintaining the peace in Afghanistan. This will ensure political and stability and security in the entire region. Mr. Akshay Mathur.
I think the Indian government has made it clear, and which is what I think is reflected in the statement, that they support a dialogue which is Afghan-led, Afghan-supported and Afghan-owned. I don't think it could be a language which is better reflective of India's position on the matter. And how that would now translate is, I think, anybody's guess. Of course, the statement from BRICS is important because keep in mind that we have Russia and China, of course, the two permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, but we also have India and South Africa, who are going to be part of the Security Council, and Brazil at the same time. And Brazil is also has been elected already to come onto the United Nations Security Council as a non-permanent member in 2 years. If there is hope, I think that it would be the dialogue and what these 4 or 5 countries can do at the United Nations. If there is consensus, it will reflect there. If you mentioned about the statement on multilateralism, it is a seminal document that has come out of BRICS, the joint statement on strengthening the multilateral system, which came out by the foreign ministers in June, on 1st June 2021, is seminal in this regard because it actually lays out the guiding principles on how the 5 countries are actually going to work on both the political multilaterals as well as the economic multilaterals. So, and they have reiterated the centrality of the United Nations. So it's not like India is not working at the United Nations along with these countries. Ambassador Bhatia has already mentioned that, of course, a lot will depend on the 2 big powers, Russia and China, and whether they can keep the commitments. But I think for what it's worth at the moment, we need to probably follow how the 5 countries are operating at the United Nations. And one more thing while we're at it, please note that yesterday at the BRICS Leader Summit, the South African president openly called for a seat for Africa at the United Nations Security Council. So clearly the 5 countries want to take a larger role, and whether an intra-Afghan led process seems to be something that they would support. It'll be, if they do so, it'll be very similar to also the positions that the countries have taken, say, in Syria, and the joint statements that you will see back from 2012 and 2013. So I think that the Indian government position is very clear from the foreign minister's statement, which we have made earlier independently, as well as from what will transpire the United Nations Security Council in the days ahead.
Right. And while India wishes and wants that that there should be peace in Afghanistan and it should not be used as a terror hub or as a terrorist sanctuary, there's also the sense that Afghanistan has to deal with its own problems. That's how I understand it. Mr. Rajan, can you explain more? How do we understand this intra-Afghan dialogue? Who would be, at the table?
I think, that's again a very important question, but I need to deconstruct the kind of phrase that is being used here. If you see the documents of the BRICS and if you compare the documents, or if you see the way India was using the term Afghan-led, Afghan-controlled kind of dialogue. But now, if you see the BRICS statement is talking about intra-Afghan dialogue. So there is clearly a kind of, semantic, there is a kind of change in the phrase which is being used. And what did India mean in real terms when it actually said Afghan-led, Afghan-controlled? Basically, it meant that other countries, especially Pakistan, should not be intervening into the politics of Afghanistan, and that's what it was doing. What has happened now is that it's not the real situation on the ground. If I can tell you, is that it's not actually intra-Afghan dialogue which is taking place. The kind of dialogue which is taking place is the Pakistan control and Taliban-led kind of dialogue. So now, if intra-Afghan dialogue would mean what? If the other countries are serious, if Taliban is serious, that should mean that they should have incorporated the members of the previous regime, Abdullah, Hamid Karzai, etc. None of that is happening. They should have tried to kind of broker a peace with the people, Ahmad Massoud, the Panjshir group, the resistance group that is fighting in the Panjshir region. So that is not happening. The kind of the rights of Hazara, etc. Hazara should have been included. That is not happening. They have included Uzbek in the government, but I don't see, as far as I know, that many Tajik people being included in the government of Taliban today. So if Tajik are not included, remember that Tajik constitutes nearly 27% of the ethnic population in Afghanistan. So if you are excluding that kind of population from the governance, how do you expect an inclusive government to come there? So what Russia, this Ambassador Bhatia clearly said that how Russia can play a role, and Russia is partly worried because if the fight in Panjshir continues between Taliban and the resistance forces, although Taliban claimed that it has already captured, but some kind of conflict is likely to continue. So if that continues, then Russia would be in trouble because the refugee problem will happen. People from Afghanistan will start going to Tajikistan. Russian forces are there. CSTO forces are there in Tajikistan. So they will face a problem and the situation will escalate. So if Taliban does not adopt an inclusive policy where it includes Tajiks, if it includes Hazaras and other communities, so it will never be considered a kind of inclusive government. And I fear that Taliban is not in mood to do that. In fact, Pakistan, with the Pakistan support and the way Foreign Minister and the members of intelligence of Pakistan are visiting Kabul, they are basically trying to install a government, a puppet government, which will be controlled by Islamabad and Rawalpindi. So that's the kind of politics which is being played, and I don't see intra-Afghan dialogue taking place in the near future.
Right. Well, Mr. Bhatia, we'd like you to come in at this point. Your thoughts that an intra-Afghan dialogue, despite it being stressed on by BRICS nations, which could have an impact. We have Russia, we have China, we have India, who are very concerned at what happens in Afghanistan at this point. Your thoughts on the challenges in this regard, an intra-Afghan dialogue?
With due respect, I think you seem to have mistaken some of us as experts on Afghanistan. Actually, we spend most of our time studying BRICS. That is our domain knowledge. So with your permission, while we all know that BRICS is particularly preoccupied with Afghanistan, in the entire New Delhi Declaration, there are barely 1 or 2 paragraphs on Afghanistan out of the 74 paragraphs. And therefore, I think in all fairness, please allow me for a minute to highlight that the real triumph of BRICS summit is the crafting, expanding and deepening of intra-BRICS cooperation. This is a major milestone for the institution. New Delhi, working on the 3rd tenure as chair, has now taken it to diverse areas. We keep talking about 3 pillars: political, economic, cultural, but it is much deeper. It is ranging from agriculture to satellites to digital health to macroeconomics to exchanges involving youth, women, diplomats, and the rest of it. I think it is important for our viewers to realize that BRICS is a very important platform. It's a major highlight of the Indian foreign policy. It gives to India a very strong sense of strategic autonomy, and it is a very important tool for India to assert and play a very global role in the world affairs today. So please forgive me, but I think it was important for me to bring this angle out as well.
Right. Mr. Bhatia, Mr. Rajan Kumar, as well as Mr. Akshay Mathur, we'll be right back with this discussion. But now it's time for a short break. Do stay tuned. You're watching In Focus.
नेशनल इलेक्ट्रॉनिक फंड ट्रांसफर, इसमें आपको किसी भी तरह का अतिरिक्त
नमस्ते इंडिया,
नमस्ते लैंड,
मरहबन इलल हिंद,
इंडिया, सलाम इंडिया,
नमस्ते इंडिया,
नमस्कार भारत,
मैं इंडिया,
नहनु हुनूर
इंडिया,
माँ हिंदी हस्ती,
हिंदियानी,
सलाम हिंदुस्तान,
वी आर इंडिया।
Your window to rising India. India's voice on global platforms. Latest news from India and around the world. In-depth analysis of global headlines. Watch DD India in your country. Available for downlink in all Southeast Asian countries. STTV broadcast is available through the satellite GSAT 17 at 93.5 degrees east. HDTV broadcast is available through the satellite GSAT 10 at 83 degrees east. For technical details, scan here. Switch to DD India now.
Welcome back. You're watching In Focus and we're discussing the New Delhi declaration that was taken yesterday as BRICS, the 13th BRICS summit chaired by India ended. In the 13th BRICS summit, the heads of Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa emphasized on increasing mutual cooperation. The action plan against terrorism was passed. Prime Minister Modi has called the grouping a powerful voice for emerging economies in the world. He asked the member groups to ensure the next 15 years for BRICS are result-oriented. PM Modi spoke about potential of the grouping as the voice for the developing world.
Your Excellencies, Rashtrapati Putin, Rashtrapati Xi, Rashtrapati Ramaphosa, Rashtrapati Bolsonaro, Namaskar.
When leaders of the world's 5 major emerging economies met virtually for the 13th BRICS summit, the agenda was boosting cooperation and helping rebuild economies in times of a global pandemic. The theme this year is BRICS at 15, intra-BRICS cooperation for continuity, consolidation and consensus. This year, India is the chair of BRICS, an acronym denoting Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa. As the chair, Prime Minister Narendra Modi laid out the agenda for the summit. He said that though the grouping had achieved a lot over the last 15 years, this was not the time to rest on one's laurels, but to ensure the next 15 years prove fruitful.
ब्रिक्स ने न्यू डेवलपमेंट बैंक, कंटीजेंसी रिजर्व अरेंजमेंट और एनर्जी रिसर्च कोऑपरेशन प्लेटफॉर्म जैसी मजबूत संस्थाओं का सृजन किया है। निसंदेह गर्व करने के लिए हमारे पास बहुत कुछ है, मगर यह भी महत्वपूर्ण है कि हम आत्मसंतुष्ट न हो और हमें यह सुनिश्चित करना है कि ब्रिक्स अगले 15 वर्षों में और परिणामदायी हो।
The Prime Minister said all 5 nations constitute a powerful voice for emerging economies of the world. This forum has effectively focused global attention on the needs of the developing world. Spelling out the achievements, Prime Minister Narendra Modi said that collective action in the coming days should make the grouping even more relevant.
मुझे विश्वास है कि आज की बैठक ब्रिक्स को भविष्य में और उपयोगी बनाने के लिए उपयुक्त दिशा देगी। हम महत्वपूर्ण वैश्विक तथा क्षेत्रीय मुद्दों पर भी चर्चा करेंगे।
Russian President Vladimir Putin raised the Afghanistan crisis and said that Afghan soil should not be used to promote terrorism and drug trafficking.
Russia, just like its BRIC partners, has consistently spoken for establishing a long-awaited peace and stability on the Afghan soil. The citizens of this country have fought for decades and deserve to exercise the right of defining what their state will look like on their own. Meanwhile, we are all interested in Afghanistan's ceasing to be a threat to the neighbors, so that the Afghan territory would be a source of drug trafficking and terrorism.
The other leaders stressed on strengthening BRICS, multilateralism, UN reforms and tackling the COVID challenge.
We have made solid progress in various areas of cooperation in the spirit of pragmatism, innovation and win-win cooperation, and we have forged ahead on our common journey of development. Our 5 countries have supported multilateralism and taken part in global governance in the spirit of equity, justice and mutual assistance, and we have become an important force on the international stage to be reckoned with.
Our cooperation has made progress, especially in the fields of science and technology, energy and healthcare, and above all in efforts to fight the COVID-19 pandemic. Bilateral trade has also expanded, and it is yet another sign of the recovery of our economies and the potential of our relations.
Each need to contribute our fair share to the Access COVID-19 Tools Accelerator and also support the proposal made by India and South Africa at the WTO for a waiver of the TRIPS mechanism to ensure a rapid expansion of COVID-19 vaccines production across the world.
India outlined 4 priority areas for its chairmanship. These are reform of the multilateral system, counter-terrorism, using digital and technological tools for achieving sustainable development goals, and enhancing people-to-people exchanges. This year also marks the 15th anniversary of BRICS. Prime Minister Narendra Modi chaired the BRICS summit for the 2nd time. In 2016, India had played the host for the 8th summit in Goa. With Meghna Dev, DD India.
And going back to our discussion here, I go across to Mr. Bhatia once again. Well, when we talk, let's move away from Afghanistan. As you said, well, what are the key takeaways you would say that prove that, you know, when BRICS reiterates its commitment to enhancing to reiterate intra-BRICS cooperation under the 3 pillars of political and security, economic and financial. Economic and financial, let's discuss that. What are the key takeaways that prove that these are just not words, that in these 15 years there have been great developments and great initiatives led by India in this regard?
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your asking this question, because you know, our actual experience of watching this institution convinces me that economic, trade and financial cooperation is really the heart of the intra-BRICS cooperation. The basic idea is that these countries should have deeper trade, financial and economic relations. This has been happening over the years, and there is a continuous attempt in terms of trying to remove the obstacles and the constraints that bar further flows. In particular, I mean, going even beyond trade, I think this whole question of creating new institutions and instruments has to be noted significantly. Just to give you an example, is a new development bank. This was a path-breaking and innovative achievement of BRICS. 5 countries are members. They put together their capital, then they support development projects in these countries, and over the years the capital has expanded. The number of projects in the bank have increased, and now we are noticing that new members are being brought in, countries like UAE, Bangladesh, Uruguay. So this is something on which the leaders, I think, expressed great satisfaction, and they asked, or they advised the new development bank to be more active in social infrastructure sectors. They also directed, more or less, the new development bank to mobilize private capital, work with the other development banks. So these are new steps, and beyond the NDB, there are other instruments, and I'm sure other panelists will talk about that. One last point, which is that beyond trade, you know, we are very clear that once there is sufficient trust and cooperation, because that unfortunately was affected quite deeply last year due to the you know, conflict between India and China. But once that trust is restored, I think BRICS can make very speedy and confident progress on these fronts.
Right. Well, Mr. Akshay Mathur, what do we understand by the Prime Minister's stressing on the reform of the multilateral system?
Yeah, I also appreciate refocusing the discussion on some of the outcomes. While, as you know, I'm not a government spokesman, but there is some serious work that has happened by the government this year. And again, the joint statement of the 5 foreign ministers published on 1st June 2021 is seminal, because it is one of the few statements that have come out, if not the only one, on how do we reform and strengthen the multilateral system. And it has guiding principles in that statement, which all 5 countries agree on. Now, you can imagine how long the efforts to reconfigure and revamp the Bretton Woods institutions have been on United Nations and its principal organs like the Security Council and Economic Council. So when in that statement, when the foreign ministers are putting down guidelines that, you know, they should be that the institutions that we have today should have better hiring processes so that there's more representation of the staff that is working in these institutions, that there is better funding and more equalized funding. So it's not like it is just funded by one country alone, that it is not just in the institution and the membership, but every single product that is being delivered by these institutions, say a financial product or a loan, all of those discussions have very good representation. And perhaps most fundamentally, that we need to reconfigure the mandate of the institutions to face new challenges. We have COVID-19. So World Bank and IMF, they were set up for a different era. How do we tackle new challenges like climate change and COVID-19 and those that are rising out of digital economy? And with that, once you take a look at that kind of a statement, that's how we can make a beginning towards strengthening the multilateral system. Now, this is not to say that there are no challenges. I mean, BRICS has many initiatives. We have over like 100 action plans, initiatives, strategies, and framework documents that we have signed in the last 12 to 15 years. We have work to do. There's a new terms of reference between the Sherpas on how to take the BRICS engagement forward. And I think particularly, this is just one last point. This is not on the multilateral system, and we can come back to it if you want, but I want to plant it here. Prime Minister Modi has made technology and digitalization central to India, as we all know. But now the Indian government has also made it central to the BRICS agenda, especially on how do we achieve SDGs. We can talk a lot more about it, but definitely from the Indian perspective, it's a very important agenda item and a way forward on how India wants to engage with BRICS and the multilateral institutions.
Right. From all that has gone in the 13th BRICS summit, from all that we have learned from from Prime Minister Modi's first engagement to his with BRICS, his chairing that meeting in Goa, that summit in Goa, and now how would you describe the path that has been travelled, Mr. Rajan?
I think I consider BRICS to be an important institution. Partly because the most important thing from my perspective is that it provides some kind of strategic autonomy to India in its dealing with the great powers. That's number one. Number two, this is the only platform where multilaterally you are engaging with Russia, and if you take along Shanghai Cooperation Organization, so Russia and China, the two countries where you are engaging with these two countries. You already have your very strong engagement with the United States, but at the same time, India's foreign policy is always it was strategic autonomy, and now the kind of term which is being used by the Ministry of External Affairs is the multi engagement. So in that engagement, if you do not have the institution like BRICS or Shanghai Cooperation Organization, so it's very likely that India's foreign policy will drift towards one particular, the Western Bloc. So that strategic autonomy is important. Second, the reason why BRICS was created, initially, if I take you to 2006 to 9 period, because these were the emerging countries, and there was a financial crisis in 2008 and 9. So the major issues that time, the major issues were economic and financial stability, and that's why you see that how two of the important institutions created by the BRICS are this NDB, New Development Bank, and the Contingency Reserve Arrangement, which actually mirror the World Bank and the IMF. So that is the second important achievement of the BRICS. But now, if you see in the last 3-4 years, the agenda has kind of it includes a lot of other topics because they're cooperating on COVID, the digital, the cooperation, energy research platform, which was mentioned by the Prime Minister's speech also, and the solar energy. India is one of the leading powers. They're also cooperating on climate change because these countries are talking of differential responsibilities, not actually going with the Western countries, but the differential responsibilities, and India is talking of per capita emission, etc. So these are the major issues, apart from, of course, the terrorism, etc., which has become in the last few years the focus of India's attention in the BRICS meeting. So these are the major takeaways of the BRICS. As far as the reforming of the multilateral system is concerned, this is very important. I was expecting a slightly better declaration, in the sense that I thought that these countries will endorse the opening up of the or reconfiguration of the United Nations Security Council. Although they mention it vaguely that they support the India, South Africa, Brazil taking larger responsibilities. But as you know, in real politics, China actually does not support that. And unless until that happens, the reforming of United Nations Security Council is difficult. On the reforming other institutions, they did mention very clearly, IMF, they said that they expressed the disappointment on the 15th General Quota Review, which has not taken place, where the quota of other countries were expected to increase. So that didn't happen. So they're expecting that the 16th General Review quota meeting that will take place. Also about the WTO, the good thing is that BRICS members expressed that confidence that they would like to abide by the international multilateral organization like WTO, United Nations, IMF, World Bank, etc. So that's one good thing. But they are seeking reform in these institutions. So reform of IMF, and this another important institution which was mentioned very clearly in the BRICS declaration is the WTO. As you know that there is an issue in the WTO, although all these BRICS countries kind of say that they believe in the core values of the WTO, but one of the problems is that US has not appointed judges in the appellate body. And the kind of role that US is playing in the WTO and also in the IMF, so that is creating a problem for some of the BRICS countries, especially the BRICS countries, to reform these institutions. So they clearly pointed out that these are the kind of reforms that should be initiated in cooperation with the BRICS country. And that's what they mean when they mean intra-BRICS cooperation for multilateral reforms, etc.
Right. Well, we'll be right back with this discussion in a short while. Meanwhile, it's time to slip into a very short break. Stay tuned.
Namaste India.
Namaste land. Marhaban ila al-Hind.
Salam India. Namaste India.
Namaskar Bharata.
Nous sommes l'Inde. نحن هنود.
India.
माँ हिंदी हस्ती.
Hindian.
Salam Hindustan.
We are India.
Your window to rising India. India's voice on global platforms. Latest news from India and around the world. In-depth analysis of global headlines. Watch DD India in your country. Available for downlink in all Southeast Asian countries. STTV broadcast is available through the satellite GSAT 17 at 93.5 degrees east. HDTV broadcast is available through the satellite GSAT 10 at 83 degrees east. For technical details, scan here. Switch to DD India now.
Welcome back. You're watching In Focus and we're talking about the New Delhi declaration that was taken at the conclusion of the 13th BRICS summit chaired by India yesterday. And we're discussing various issues from the New Delhi declaration with our distinguished guests in the panel. Coming to you, Mr. Bhatia, let's discuss about how BRICS nations did contribute and the road ahead as far as contribution in as far as dealing with one of the biggest crises that the entire world has undergone in recent years, that's COVID-19. First of all, there was stress that was laid in the New Delhi declaration on cooperation on study of origins of SARS-CoV-2. How do you see this panning out? How does BRICS see this panning out?
Thank you very much for raising a very important aspect which we had not covered so far. I think COVID certainly provides the most potent backdrop in which today nations interact with each other, and BRICS is no exception at all, especially because all BRICS nations were among the countries that were badly affected, very adversely affected by this devastating pandemic, coronavirus 19. I think there are views outside the governments that the BRICS governments could have done much better by adopting a stand of solidarity and unity. After all, out of these 5 countries, 3 produced COVID vaccines. So now they're taking a clear cue from their previous experience, and therefore one of the major achievements of the recent deliberations is to go and set up a new vaccine research and development center for the future. I think this would be regarded as a singular which has found favor is the idea that there should be equal or equitable access of nations and peoples to not merely vaccines but also medicines, therapeutics, diagnostics, etc. Actually, South Africa's President Ramaphosa made a very clear and categorical plea there as well. Finally, with regard to the question of origin, I think this goes to the strength of BRICS and to the candor and courage that it has shown, that it found just the right formulation to put focus on the scientific study of the origin of virus without raising the hackles of China. So we can see in that formulation, as former diplomats, it is our job to study the words and phrases. We can see they have put in a few phrases to make it all acceptable to the Chinese side, and yet the world's concern on this matter, which got reflected very clearly in the deliberations of World Health Organization, they have found a very nuanced and balanced formulation to say that the origin should be studied scientifically so that we can insulate humanity from future catastrophes of this kind, which was a very positive thing. So these three aspects, I hope, answer the query which you have very wisely raised with me.
Right. Well, Akshay, how do we understand the objective assessment of vaccines that the New Delhi Declaration has talked about? And how do you see this moving forward?
I think, first of all, you might have noticed that that there's an acknowledgement of the discussions at the WTO. In the declaration, there is an acknowledgement that there are discussions taking place at the WTO on the proposal that India and South Africa have put forward, and that it reflects in the declaration. They have said that there are avenues within the TRIPS agreement, within the Doha Declaration. There are agreements at the WTO within which we can have that discussion. Now, the India and South Africa proposal has gained as much traction as we would have liked it to. But nevertheless, I think it is a proposal that we have put forward, and there are discussions taking place. There are countries in the West that are opposing it. And there are countries, even some countries within the developing world that have not yet given support to it. I think that one, India and South Africa will have to do better in trying to galvanize support first within BRICS, and then with the rest of the developing nations on seeking a better response on our request for waiving of the IPR on vaccines. Having said that, it is also true that that most of the nations now are focused on the economic recovery. And so what has also happened is that the focus of the developing countries has moved away from asking for the IPR to actually asking for either the vaccines directly or asking for the funding to pay for the vaccines. And that's a perfectly logical position for a lot of developing countries to take. Ambassador Bhatti mentioned that there's already a virtual vaccine R&D center that is being supported by BRICS. And I think that's one way in which the discussions can continue.
Right. Well, we've come to the end of the show, in fact, and there's very little time left. So, Rajan, I would like you to very quickly sum up in as fewest words as is possible. I'm very sorry, but what you feel is the message that has gone out at the end of the 13th BRICS summit. It's the first major summit, can we say, after countries are limping back to normalcy.
I think the most important message is that some of the people make a joke of BRICS that it's a kind of acronym without substance. So let me tell you that it's not an acronym without substance. It has a lot of potential. It is working towards that. As you can see that it continues. Continuity was one of the important themes for the BRICS: continuation, consolidation, and consensus. So these are very, very important things for the BRICS states, and they are willing to cooperate, and they're expanding their areas right from multilateral reform to terrorism, to digital cooperation and sustainable development, etc., people-to-people cooperation. So these are important issues, and I think BRICS has a huge potential because it has started creating institutions also, institutions which play a very important role in kind of creating an equilibrium in the international system. So I'm very hopeful that BRICS will emerge as a very powerful institution in the coming years. Thank you.
Right. Many thanks to you, Mr. Bhatia, and also to Akshay and Rajan, our distinguished guests on the panel, and for your invaluable inputs. And to all our viewers as well for joining us here on the show as we discussed about the New Delhi Declaration, and in which a consensus was arrived at on the part of all the BRICS nations on various issues. With that, it's a wrap on this edition of In Focus. Thanks for watching. Namaskar.
The changing world of news.